hear us okay?
Yeah.
Okay, well, welcome to the Silent Disco. Thank you all for being here this morning.
Okay, let's get started talking about building secure applications with Azure Policy and service groups. My name is Kemley. I'm a PM on the Azure governance team focused on organizing resources. So there are services such as management groups, tags, and service groups.
And I'm Jody. I'm on the same team as Kemley, focused mainly on Azure Policy. And we'll also have 𝗦𝗽𝗀𝗀𝗀𝗀 coming up to join us to speak a little bit about machine configuration about halfway through the session.
Cool. Today we have a packed agenda. We'll start out talking a bit about the importance of organizing your resources and how to use the newly public preview service groups to be able to leverage that functionality. We'll go through when to use service groups, what are service groups, and also a quick demo. And then we'll pivot over to Azure Policy and how do you secure it. We'll also dive into some new Copilot experiences on Azure Policy, and then wrap it up with a real-world example about how we are protecting Azure using the same services we talk about today. Cool. With that, let's talk about service groups. So as everyone is probably familiar to what Azure tenants look like, you probably have a tenant similar to this. You have multiple management groups that span across your dev, non-prod, and production environment. You have loads of subscriptions that you're using for billing, provisioning, and making sure that they're doing good. And you have resource groups for your region-based deployments and for things around resiliency and tons of these and managing them all. And while these are really good at the functions that they do have a rigid hierarchy, right? Resource groups must belong to subscriptions. Subscriptions can only belong to one management group. Management group can only have subscriptions. And so it provides one context, but it doesn't provide all the business context that goes into it. There's other information that are missing. Usually information around like cost codes, resiliency, monitoring, different personas that need information. You're trying to aggregate, show leadership, show security, show all these people the different mechanisms that you're doing with your resources. And right now, there's a bit of a gap in the product. And that's where service groups came in. Service groups are a tenant-level flexible hierarchy to group resources, which include resources, resource groups, and subscriptions across your tenant and across all boundaries. They're independent and parallel to the existing hierarchy. This is purposeful so that you can include things across the tenant. So we often say tenant level, and it's a little scary, right? You're like, oh man, this is going to have huge impact. Unlike previous tenant level resources, service groups does not have RBAC or policy inheritance. So what that means is if I were to give Jody access to, let's say, an instance here in this chart, she doesn't automatically get access to the resources underneath it. But she is able to see different metrics and aggregations that I might give her access to see. This is purposeful. It is meant to keep service groups least privilege so that you can have a persona-based access. So you're able to give access to incident managers or operations or app views for different purposes. So some key features of service groups. First is hierarchy. Often when we talk about applications, we talk about the hierarchy in which it lives in. What are the instances? What are the stamps? What are the components? Where do they roll up to? What service do they power? And so we have up to 10 levels of depth on service groups to be able to give you that flexibility. In talking about flexibility, you can have resource groups, and subscriptions all a part of your service group. So, and on top of that, they can be part of multiple service groups. So you're able to have different topologies and different viewpoints as you need. And once you have the group comes the fun stuff. Actually be able to do aggregation and telemetry and information and different values around that group that you represent. Okay, no freaking out. Management groups, subscriptions, and resource groups tags are not going away. We still recommend them as is, and they're still there. Service groups is meant to be complementary. Management groups will still be needed for separations of non-prod and production, and it's still the recommended scope to be able to do RBAC and policy at scale. Tags are still important for business contacts if you want to add owner information or rings for deployment. And subscriptions and resource groups are still required for deployment and for billing. Ultimately, service groups is an additional for you to use in certain scenarios. We often hear people come to us and ask, hey, I want to be able to group certain things as compliant, non-compliant, but they must be applicable, or I need to remediate them, but I don't want someone to go in and change that value on the resource or go in and remove that tag. Service groups has a RBAC mechanism, so you can only remove membership to the service group unless you have access to that service group. So it helps you do that dynamicness while also limiting control to the subset of users. Cool. With that, we'll talk a little bit about how we recommend getting started. At the end of the session, I'll talk about how we have been leveraging this and kind of where the inspiration for some of these things come for. But for now, let's talk about some key points. First, we really recommend prioritizing critical nodes. Everyone here knows what is critical for their business, what the business needs at a minimum to be able to function day to day. Those are the most important to have your inventory of and be aware of, to be able to take actions and drive resolutions. These can be applications, foundational services, and more. Next, we recommend standardization from the beginning. So oftentimes we see the central team will create the top level of the hierarchy. So they'll define the services, the layout, and the different topologies. But from there, can hand on to the subject matter experts to hand out, what is the service level breakdown, what is the application level breakdown. But even then, we recommend having clear identifiers and contents required. The standardization is key for eventual consumption. Next, shift left as much as possible. Let's automate membership. Let's make sure membership is there at deployment time with the resources. Let's use things like Azure Policy to be able to do membership at scale. And we'll talk a little bit about that as well later. And last is controlled consumption. As we've gone through this effort, we've also noticed once you have it, a lot of people are gonna ask for it, right? Security teams reaching out, finance teams reaching out, dependencies reaching out. How do we use this to better our services? So controlled consumption is needed, and we follow the RBAC mechanism to be able to consume this information. Cool. With that, let's talk about how do you actually model this and use service groups. So here is 𝗲𝗲's tenant. I'm sure you guys have heard about it already for the next couple of days. So 𝗲𝗲 has a pretty standard tenant, some non-prod, prod. They have a couple subscriptions with some shared services. Sarah here is an app developer on the claims customer support team. So she has a claims application that's spread across the whole tenant. She has some tags that manage it. She has a naming convention, a resource group, but it's kind of all over the place. So it's really hard for her to kind of show that information. Lucky for her, 𝗲𝗲 decided to go through and inventory all their applications. And they gave some strict requirements. First, all SGs must be under their respective subdivision. Lucky for her, the cloud admins already started it. So this is what her current hierarchy looks like. All her stamps must follow the identifier at 𝗲𝗲.appID. Her app ID is just claims, very straightforward. And then all stamps must have a following identifier, appid.stamp.region. This is be able to know for future dependency mapping and impact analysis, if something goes down, what region did it impact, or what stamp, and how do we get things up and running. And lastly, they told her, automate as much as possible. Cool. So going into the portal experience, we could see here that I landed within the customer support view. I'm gonna make sure I'm under the right parent. So I see customer home applications, checking around. Yeah, looks about right. I think customer support is where we belong. I can see here some information on the service groups, such as the ID and provisioning type in the parents. But let me see how Copilot can help me create a little bit more under this. I'm gonna type into Copilot and say, create a service group. When you create a service group, anyone within the tenant is able to create it. RBAC really comes in the membership. You must have access to those resources to make them members of the service group. To create the service group, you must provide two informations. First, the service group ID, which must be globally unique, and the ID of the parent of which you want to be connected to. Because I'm using Copilot, Copilot's able to take in the context and know that I want my parent to be the customer support applications where I'm at. From there, Copilot takes in the prompts and they'll create the service group. Cool, there's my service group. Now I have the group, great. Let's start adding some members because that's really the important thing. As we mentioned previously, Sarah has a couple of different members. She's gonna wanna start out by adding, let's just say the tags that have that bulk application ID, which equals claims. I'm gonna type that prompt into Copilot so that it can hopefully add the resources that it finds that have that tagged, which I have access to, and then add them also to my service group that I just created. What Copilot will do is now it's going to use the power of Azure Resource Graph, or a single pane of view of all the resources that exist, to look for anything that has that tag bulk application ID. You can see that it will determine and output the query of which it's using. From there, Copilot will take that query, run it, always being sure of my permissions of which I had, and then add those members to the 𝗲𝗲.claim service group which I created. There we go. It told me it found about 5 members, and if I click on the members tabs of service group, I can see them there. Perfect. Have my service group, I have my members. Now let's talk about how to automate a bit more. We recommend shifting left as much as possible and having this as part of the deployment process. Here's an example bicep template in which I'm deploying two storage accounts, the service group and the service group member relationship, to ensure that they're automatically added. This could also be used for future jobs to be done efforts, right? You're scaling up, scaling down, wanting to make sure these are the services I need to go and make sure are running properly. Next is the Azure Policy definition. Because of Azure Policy's ability to deploy resources, we're able to use the conditions which policy supports to have complex deployment. Here it's pretty straightforward, in which we're just checking for a tag name and value, saying hey, if you pick up any resources that have that tag name and value, then deploy the membership to the respective service group in which it belongs to. Just given the normal power of policy, you can expand those conditions to different criteria, to different scopes, to different configurations of the resources. As Sarah did this work, now she has her estate. So you can see here, she has her claims front end and a couple different information that goes there. Now comes to the good part. How does she get different metrics on top of it? All service group and service group member information is available through Azure Resource Graph. So from Azure Resource Graph, you're able to join across different tables to get important metrics. For example, here's a sample query where you're able to get non-compliant resources with the selected service group. This query and the templates I showed below will be a part of documentation, which you can find publicly today. But if you go to Portal, you'll also be able to see first-class experiences that we have. We have integrations with Azure Monitor to be able to see how do you monitor the service group better, how do you create alerts, how do you get additional information on your application. You can also do resiliency, set goals, and make your app more resilient, and take actions to make sure your resources are zone resilient. As I mentioned, all of that is available today. Service groups is publicly available in all tenants. You're able to do membership for all ARM resource groups and subscriptions. We have API, Portal, Copilot, ARM templates, Bicep, and Terraform support all ready to go. What's next? We're looking to expand out our PowerShell and other SDK support, and we're working on a native condition-based membership. So at service group creation time, you're able to define the condition of which you want membership to occur. And the system, on your behalf, will remove and add members as needed and based off of changes. We're also working to add more relationship types, not beyond just service group member. You're able to define dependencies between your applications or services. You're able to define what is backed by, what downstream and upstream inputs that might be required, and more first-class experiences that will come as well. With that, I'll pass it over to Jody to talk a little bit more about securing your application.
Awesome. Thanks, Kemley. So I'm really glad we actually talked about service groups and sort of our resource organization space ahead of talking about Azure Policy, because at the end of the day, the degree to which you can use policy effectively at scale really depends on how well and how carefully you've designed the organization of your environment in Azure. So before I get started, I'll just do a quick show of hands. How many of you are using policy today across, I don't know, more than 100 subscriptions? Okay, we've got a few. We had a lot of hands at the beginning, a few more on the second question. So I think we'll go into detail on how we're focused on making it easier to use policy, really at any scale, and specifically focused on how we are using Azure Policy within Microsoft's own tenants today as well. So before we go into the details, right, on some new features that we have on the policy side, I think it's really important that we first ground this discussion in a little behind the scenes look in the architecture today that enables us to create a generic configuration management platform as well as generic grouping constructs like service groups. So the reason why we can make these platform level investments that allow you to use the same services to manage resource types from compute VMs, storage accounts, VMSS, Kubernetes clusters, is really because of the Azure Resource Manager. The Azure Resource Manager, when we talk about this, people typically think of things like ARM templates, but it's really a lot more than that. And I think it's important for us to also make sure that you have full awareness of this system so that you can take advantage of the services that are built directly on top of ARM. So the way the Resource Manager works today is it provides a consistent API layer that all resource create, update, delete requests come through. And the journey of a request into Azure goes through a couple of checks. So the first check is always going to be the access layer, right? So does the caller have the required permissions in order to fulfill the operation intended? The second evaluation is, is this resource request compliant against policies that you've described, at the scope where that resource request is landing? And again, this is both for enforcement as well as compliance, and enforcement works, real time on create and update. Through the effects that we have here. I saw a lot of hands in the room for folks who are using policies, so I won't go into a ton of detail on this now, but we'll be deep diving into how we actually use deploy if not exist, as well as deny within Microsoft's tenants. And of course, compliance, again, on resource change, on demand, or on a periodic cadence through APIs that we provide. So let's talk about some investments that we've been making over the last year into the Azure Policy platform. We typically try to focus our investments into, some version of these three categories. The first one being safety. Ultimately, rolling out impactful policies at a high scope is a fancy way of saying a breaking change, right? So how do you make sure that you can roll out these, configuration changes in a way that's safe, deterministic, and, doesn't impact the availability of the services that you are ultimately running on Azure? The second is language and expression. So lots of hands up when I asked who is already using policy. And ultimately, any new service takes time and investment to learn and grow your teams around. And so we want to make sure that that return on your investment is always increasing through adding additional power and capabilities into the policy language and framework. And the last thing is the user experience. And so I'm really excited today about a couple of announcements we'll be going into on the UX side. But ultimately, as we add additional language components and capabilities into the policy framework, there's an increase in the complexity to use these. So we've been really focused on how we can make it easy for you to adopt these new primitives and also become aware more easily of all of the goodness that's sort of landing in the space. So there are a couple of releases that we'll be deep diving to specifically in the language and expression space. So I'll first be talking about a feature that's now in preview called IP filtering. So we talked a little bit about sort of the journey of that request to a resource creation. And the second check there, right, was is the configuration of this resource compliant against policies that you might have on the group or container where you're landing this resource. But we're actually expanding Azure Policy to not just govern, the what, but really the how this resource is being created. So IP filtering effectively allows you to govern, an expected IP range that you expect resource requests to come through. But the broader expansion of policy here isn't just into IP filtering, but it's moving towards evaluating the request context of the create, update, delete request itself. One example, right, is a lot of us are working on distributed teams. A lot of the times when we talk to customers, there are very real reasons why you should only expect certain high privilege requests to come from a specific geography or specific workplace. So IP filtering will allow you to accomplish that and make sure that again, not only the what but the how is governable by your central teams. The second feature I want to go into a little bit more detail on is actually identity-based exemptions. So this is one we're super excited about, and again, we've already started to use within our own environments. And this is an extension to, or sort of another pivot on the exemption feature that we have in Azure Policy that we know that you guys know and you love. And the main difference with identity-based exemptions is actually that you will now not only be able to exempt specific resources or scopes, but also exempt based on a certain service principle or ID. So one of the huge benefits of this feature is that it'll allow you to avoid over-exempting for specific scenarios that are more expected. And we'll go into sort of a real-world example as well on how we've already begun to use this across Microsoft's own environment. But to give a little bit more detail on this specific example, right, you can see here that I have a policy assignment, and this is a snippet from a broader policy that's intended to limit the high-cost SKUs that developers in my tenant are able to deploy. And so you can see here that when I tried to make that request, it was blocked by policy because my principal ID is not within the exempted selector. But when Kemley tries to deploy this same VM, her request would be approved. So you now no longer need to apply an exemption, for the entire organization that both Kemley and I work in. You can really target this exemption to, limit cases where, your teams are ultimately deploying resources that are non-compliant. The other example here that you could imagine, right, is, there could be n number of reasons why you don't want your teams to ultimately touch your networking resources at all. But you want your network admins to be able to go in and make, necessary changes, again, either from an approved app ID or an approved, list of identities. So user identity-based exemptions really allow you to, get even more granular on the exemption object. And we're really excited to, see this finally land as a first-class citizen in Azure Policy. So we've talked a lot about, what's new with the policy language today and how you can continue to, use it to govern your resources in Azure. But I wanted to take a step back and also talk a little bit about how you can manage, resources anywhere, through Azure Arc, through Azure Policy. And so I'll be passing it to 𝗦𝗽𝗀𝗀𝗶𝗫, a PM also on our team, to speak in a little bit more detail on how we are, continuing to invest in our experiences of VM OS server configuration management through machine configuration and policy.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Can everyone hear me just fine? Okay. Okay, cool. Sounds good. So just as Jody mentioned, the Azure governance team has done a lot of work to make policy more powerful and extensible over the past couple of years. Part of that means that we embarked on a journey a couple of years ago to extend policy capabilities into in-guest configuration management. What this means is that now you can leverage Azure Policy to govern the in-guest resources within your machine, such as operating system settings, across Windows and Linux, uniformly at scale for both Arc machines and Azure Compute machines. And so that enables you to bring governance anywhere. And so part of what we've been doing on this journey is essentially thinking about top priority scenarios that customers leverage to manage their in-guest operating system settings. Part of that is that a lot of organizations, especially in a vastly evolving security landscape, have to comply to many different security standards at scale. This means that for a long time, a lot of customers have to manage the security configurations of their machines. They have to maintain custom code for over 300 settings contained within CIS benchmarks or in the Azure Linux benchmarks that we have available today. We're excited to announce the public preview availability of customizable security baselines in Azure Machine Configuration. This allows you to bring security compliance at scale uniformly for both Windows and Linux in your environment without having to think about custom tooling. And so we're excited to show you some of the capabilities we're enabling as a result of this experience. So first things first is that, as the name suggests, we want to enable you to have as much expression as possible when incorporating your internal requirements within your organization compliance. And so what this means is that not only can you customize values, you can exclude values contained within a benchmark that are not relevant to your environment. So let's say, for example, we'll take a look at this in a demo soon. Your organization has to comply to CIS for whatever reason, but you don't leverage cron in your Linux environment. You leverage bcron. And so we allow you to exclude settings that reference cron from being implemented in your environment. In order to maximize compatibility with your CI/CD workflows, we've integrated this experience tightly with policy as code workflows so that you can much more natively leverage the Azure Policy SDK to make deployments through code templates. In addition, we wanted to make sure that this experience is something that's helpful and pleasant to experience. Baselines contain over 300 settings, and it's really hard to keep track of that and to share templates out for approval within your security teams before enforcement at scale. And so now we're excited to announce that we've also brought an Azure Policy experience that allows you to look through the different settings that we have available, search through them, view metadata so that you can understand the behavior of these settings. For the Azure Windows baseline, you can also take a look at the group policy path that these settings implement. I know that's a huge pain point for many folks. And you're also able to export these templates out so that you can share your compliance before making deployments within your environment. And so the policies that we're excited to announce that support this feature are the Azure Windows baseline, the Azure Linux baseline that we're all familiar with, but we've also introduced a new CIS benchmark for Linux that allows you to apply CIS benchmarks to all supported Linux distros within Azure today. And so now we'll go into a demo just so that you can see how this experience works end to end. So within Azure Policy, we have a list of, and we picked the CIS as an example, we have a list of distros that are available today that support CIS benchmarks. And so now we want to be able to see all the different settings contained within it. We're also able to use the experience to search for the relevant settings and exclude them by taking them out from the checkbox. We can also customize the input values of the settings in here by using the edit experience that we've provided. And you can see that that way you can deviate from default values within it. You can also view additional metadata about the settings that you're trying to configure so that you can understand their behavior a little bit better within your environment. So once that's done, you now have the capability to download this template so that you can make repeatable deployments in your environment, either through the Azure portal or CI/CD. In this case, we'll be passing this values as input into a policy parameter called baseline settings that will allow you to basically upload these templates in a repeatable manner into your policy deployment workflow. And so that's nice and simple. And if you're already familiar with using Azure Policy, the great news is you don't need to learn any new workflows to leverage this experience today. Now, as part of our journey to continue extending Azure governance capabilities into in-guest resources, we're super excited to tell you that we'll now be embarking on the journey of modeling settings as resources in Azure today. And so you can think of all the workflows you're familiar with ARG, change analysis, Azure Policy, where you're able to reference specific resources in Azure as aliases within a policy or with tables in Azure Resource Graph. We're really excited to say that we'll also be doing the same modeling for each and every single supported setting within a VM so that you can also do queries at scale within Azure Resource Graph. And so because sharing is caring, we're now onboarding customers onto our private preview experience. So if you want to be part of the disruptive direction that we're taking with this work, you can scan the QR code, and then we'll be able to onboard you to our private preview and incorporate your requirements as we expand. We're starting off with users and group settings, so you'll be able to ask queries like which local administrators exist in my environment or which local accounts have passwords that are expired, and then we'll be able to scale into many more other scenarios. And so we're excited about embarking on this journey, and thanks so much for showing up and being interested in hearing about machine config. I'll pass it back to Jody.
Awesome. Thanks, 𝗦𝗽𝗀𝗀𝗀. And just on this topic as well, if you want to see a demo of this live, please make sure to check out the Azure Arc Lab that I think will be today at 3:45. That's 3:45. So stay tuned and stay in touch through the QR link here. It's also linked at the end of the deck, so we will be back. Awesome. So staying on the topic of policy, one of the things that we've sort of hinted at Build last year and has really been in the works is sort of this idea of intelligent governance. So ahead of going into our demo and sort of showing you guys what we have for you today, I think it's also important to sort of take a step back and talk about why we're doing this now. So I mentioned before that the policy language is constantly getting more powerful, but if you think about a chart, right, that also means that the complexity of policy increases, and we want to make it easy for advanced users to immediately take advantage of new capabilities, but we also want to make it easier for new users to really deeply understand the policy framework and learn more about maybe existing policies that are being applied or net new policies that are required for a campaign within your environment. So our solution for this is intelligent policy authoring through an embedded LLM-based experience within the policy UX. So I'll go into a demo in just a second, but I think a couple of things to call out. The goal here really is to make it easy for you to move from business requirements to actionable guardrails quickly in your environment, but also make sure that we provide you with the tools to fully understand the expressions that are being used in that definition, and also sort of like stress test any of the output as well. So we'll go into a couple of the experiences that we have available today in limited preview. But again, this is really just the beginning. This is our first step into this space, and so you can kind of expect to see more sort of on the intelligent governance side over the coming months as well. Okay, so let's take a look at the demo of prompt to policy. One of the things that we didn't get to talk about a lot was we've actually given the Azure Policy UX a little bit of a facelift. So we have improved summarization of action cards, and even have an option for you to customize the action cards that will persist on your homepage, based on whatever is most important to you and your environment. We're also trying to make sure that you can immediately take advantage of new features through our Getting Started page, which will constantly be the place where you can go to see the latest and greatest. Clicking into that, this is the Azure Policy definitions flow, and you can see in the target description, I'm authoring a prompt because I want a policy to see if I have any storage accounts with anonymous blob access enabled. So this looks and feels like the existing policy definitions create flow, but we're moving from prompt to definition natively within the same page. There are a couple of other shortcuts that I just want to talk about a little bit, and we'll demo as well, is the Command I shortcut. So this is what I was mentioning earlier around how can you actually interrogate the definition that is output, and also maybe suggest changes if it didn't get it exactly right. So you can see here that a policy has been generated to evaluate if allow public blob access equals true. And I'm asking Copilot, why is this equals true versus not equals? Because a lot of the time in my policy definitions, I take a dependency on the not equals clause. So I'm asking that question. It's going to think for a second and then educate me a little bit on how equals differs from not equals in policy evaluation, and also mention that this maps to the prompt that I had put above. So I actually got it a little bit wrong. I kind of want to see where we're currently at around storage accounts that are deployed with anonymous blob access disabled. So I've asked Copilot to adjust this, and you can see that I've been able to accept those changes in line and now have a policy definition that maps my desired output. So we're really excited that this is now in limited preview. We've got a short link at the end if you want to try it out. But again, this is sort of our first step into this intelligent governance space. So stress test it, let us know if you have any feedback, and please check out the new Azure Policy UX as well. Really excited to see some of those improvements landed and available for you today. So, okay, we're pushing up against the clock. I'm going to go really quick through our roadmap. So a couple of things that I want to just make sure that you guys are aware of. So first things first, what if API? So let's talk about how we're going to make it possible for you to actually better understand, the impact of a policy ahead of applying it. And this will also be really important as you, try to understand the impact of, maybe AI-generated policies as well. So these two features will go hand in hand. Second is support for governing post-API requests. So, moving beyond just create, update, delete into post requests. Third thing I want to mention is external evaluations in policy. So we're going to be expanding policy to not only be able to audit and analyze based on properties in the Azure Resource Manager, but maybe beyond to an external data source, including ARG, or maybe a custom endpoint where you have business critical data that you manage within your own environment. So a little bit on our roadmap. Happy to talk about any of these in more detail towards the end of the session after Q&A as well. Okay, so now we're going to take a little bit of an inside look at how we manage Azure's largest environment. So before we get into it, I have explicit permission from this customer to, really dive into how they manage their environment in Azure. Are there any guesses on what Azure's largest customer is? Joy, do you have any guesses? Close. So it's Microsoft. So we manage the largest Azure environment today, and all of the products that we're building for all of you are really based on like first principles and the needs within our own organization to manage an environment at a huge, huge, huge scale. So we use Azure Policy across quality and security campaigns to make sure that we have guardrails that map to our business requirements. We use Azure Resource Graph as the sole source of inventory, from resources in our physical data center to, as 𝗦𝗽𝗀𝗀𝗀 mentioned, through machine configuration, our compute operating system fleet, all the way up into services and applications that Kemley will talk about a little bit more in our in-depth example. Again, we use management groups, subscriptions, resource groups, service groups, and relationships. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about some really specific examples on how these products all come together to really act as the foundation for Microsoft's own governance story. So, again, why now? So this is something we've talked about a lot publicly in the last year, and it's really the Secure Future initiative. So it's Microsoft's commitment to ensuring that our services, start and stay secure. It's something we take incredibly seriously. And one area where we've taken an outsized dependency on Azure Policy is actually the secure by default component, right? So what does secure by default mean? It means that anytime we have a new resource or new service that spins up in Azure, we need to hold it to a higher degree of security and quality, because at the end of the day, this is when we have the most control over really getting things right. So let's talk about a few really specific campaigns that we've used all of the governance services that we've talked about to really drive internally across so many services and subscriptions. So the first one I'll talk about is limiting the use of remoting tools. So within Microsoft, our development environment and the environment that our engineers work within is incredibly locked down. And one of the things that we're constantly focused on is limiting the ways that data comes in and data goes out. So one sort of defense in-depth effort that we embarked on this year was limiting the use of remoting tools, which can provide a path to maybe unwanted data transfer. So what we did was deploy policies to block the installation of custom script as well as run command. But at the end of the day, some services actually have a dependency on these extensions. So what we were able to do is move the entire program forward through a deny policy at the tenant root, but then leverage identity-based exemptions so that we could make sure that we don't break services in the process, but also we don't block the progression of the entire program based on a couple of outliers. So this is one example of how we're using identity-based exemptions as well as deny policy across a super, super high scope. The second two that are in bold, again, are really based on Azure Policy. And so the first is disabling anonymous blob access for all new and existing storage accounts. So this was a deny policy campaign that we had to handle extremely carefully. And we'll talk a little bit about sort of the end-to-end process for how we can gradually roll these out while maintaining sort of that sense of urgency. And the third is deploying security extensions across our compute estate, which leverages deploy if not exist policy. So again, I mentioned this at the beginning. Rolling out policy can be thought of as rolling out a breaking change a lot of the time. So how do you do this safely? So this is a bit of an inside look at how we handle rolling out policies today within our own environment. The first is always an audit policy rollout. Ahead of making any changes to your environment, you want to have sort of that clean slate or clean compliance record that you can reference as you develop this SDP plan. That'll inform, the rings or the regions that you want to progress through. That'll inform, sort of how large the bleeding is, and it'll inform sort of the speed at which you want to move through these three stages. So the second stage is something that is, relatively new, and we're investing in, first-class primitives to make this even easier, and it's opt-in policy rollout. So at the end of the day, right, there are n number of health signals that services within your environments use to determine if they are healthy or in a good state. And it's hard centrally to, always maintain a full picture of that health. So the best way to know if a team is ready for policy enforcement is to actually have them tell you, right? You can think of opt-in policy as, a way that teams subscribe to policy enforcement. There are a couple of primitives that we have in the platform today, and we'll also be releasing a new feature called policy enrollments, which you can think of as the anti-exemption that allow teams to effectively subscribe to policy enforcement. And then the third is central enforcement. So after you've reached enough saturation of that opt-in policy, again, super important that you lock it down to also integrate with the subscription create flow through implementing that deny or dine policy. You know, at the current level that you operate, whether that's tenant root or a management group. So I'll leave this on the screen for a bit. These slides will be available as well after the session if you want to refer back to it. But let's talk about a couple you know, more in-depth campaigns on how we use specifically resource graph and service groups to govern our environment.
Yeah, thank you, Jody. So I'm going to deep dive a little bit more on how we're protecting Microsoft against unsafe deletions. But to start off, a little background into our own inventory campaign. I kind of mentioned it at the beginning in our own learnings of getting started with service groups. But Microsoft is in a mission to ensure we have a unified, secure, and actionable assets. And as mentioned, assets are anything from the physical level, the individual VM operating system configurations, all the way up to service instances and applications that are represented. So we're really getting a full stack view here. We follow standardization and modeling for all those resources, which really helps in our cross-domain use. This is really key for things like dependency mapping, which we're using internally to be able to assess impact and triage whenever things go wrong. Here's an example of guidance that we give to service teams. This is key information that they must comply with, information like location and identifiers and parents and such. And that's important for us to be doing it. Now that we have our inventory with the use of policy, we're able to talk about how do we make sure that things are happening safely. We usually like to talk about things in create and updates and security and governance in that space, but deletes are also critical. And while we're running these critical infrastructures, there are things that we want to put deny delete policies on to make sure that they're locked and never deleted. But we also want to make sure in scaled down scenarios that anything that is deleted doesn't have any lasting impacts. So we're running a safe deletion campaign across all of our Microsoft tenants to ensure that any deletions that happen are guaranteed safe. What does safe mean? Well, for us, a delete needs to come from a trusted endpoint. We need to make sure that the resource is not in use, and importantly, that that resource does not have any dependencies. So if that resource is deleted, there's no impact. So with the power of policy and the inventory that we have in Resource Graph, we're able to bring the whole story together and ensure that we're securing Microsoft from any unwanted or accidental deletions. Cool. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here and talking a little bit more and learning more about how we're building and securing our applications. Please stay in touch. We have a couple QR codes, and there'll also be flyers being handed out to get more feedback and give us some more feedback on all the governance services. Thank you.
Awesome.
Thank you. And we left absolutely no time for questions. So it's 15, and we'll also be at the Migrate and Modernize booth tomorrow. We've got Joy at the back. Joy, I don't know if you want to wave, who's also got a couple of handouts there that you can take if you want to sort of refer back to these QR codes for the rest of the conference. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.